Nipper Away Dharma Talks.
Talk 1, 20th of May 2012. Right Action. Professor Geoffrey Hunt talks about mindfulness and non-harm.
Right, you may remember that we've now reached right action, as it's traditionally called. Let's call it helpful action. Helpful, that is, to attaining wisdom, compassion and peace. And I'd like to focus today on a central idea of right action, which is non-harm, known as ahimsa, both in Hinduism and in Buddhism. And of course, non-harm is not alien to Western ethics. In ancient teachings of the West, whether that of the Old Testament or the New Testament, there is the idea of not killing. This is controversial in some ways. It's difficult to think about what it means when we consider our lifestyle and when we consider questions, for example, such as self-defense and many other issues. What I want to think about in terms of non-harm, well, first of all, why is it important to following the Dharma at all? What do we mean by non-harm? Well, if we have an attitude of exploitativeness or manipulativeness towards the world in order to defend and build up the power of the self, we're going in the opposite direction from the Dharma. Our idea is that wisdom, compassion, and ultimately peace are attained through subduing the self. I don't mean subduing it in terms of controlling it, but subduing it in the sense of letting go of our continual struggle to maintain and build up the self. Now, in doing that, in maintaining and building up the self, we may find ourselves in situations where either we are being overly reactive in the situations we find ourselves, or we are even becoming harmful and even violent in order to get what we want. So we can see how this is connected with the teaching, because of the connection with the self. So if we are working on understanding the self as something which doesn't have any independent existence, which is connected deeply with everything else, which is what Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing. If we understand that, then we have no inclination to be manipulative, exploitative, vengeful, let alone think of using any kind of violence towards other creatures or towards other human beings. And now it will be said by some, especially since Freud, that violence as well as lust are part of our nature. They're deeply embedded in our unconscious. Of course, a lot of people have taken issue with Freud on that. But it is a commonplace. We can see for ourselves, without Freud, that there is a potential for violence, etc., within us. Because it's a constant possibility. If I feel insulted, hurt, threatened, indignation, anger, then it is possible for me to go in that direction. I may or I may not, but it's there. Or I may have violent thoughts, which I don't put into practice. One survey showed that something like 90% roughly, of men that were interviewed, quite a lot of them, had violent thoughts at some time or another. Some of them pretty gruesome violent thoughts, but they will always say, but I wouldn't act on it. They just come into my head. And something like 60-65% of women also have violent thoughts, especially when they're hurt by a partner or someone who leaves them, something like this. So it is no secret. We don't need Freud to tell us that that potential is there. We know it's there. But if you think about it, if you look into its nature, you'll see that it's connected very much with oneself, with a sense of a self that needs to be protected and promoted. One doesn't react or even have very violent thoughts if this self is at, if you like, a low level in which interconnectedness is a fact of life. Now, the most difficult thing to talk about with non-harm, I think, is not overt violence, but illicit or implicit violence. And that is the harm we may be doing just by our lifestyle, just by accepting the norms of society. We're all part of a society and interlinked with it through our work and as citizens, in which violence and harm is an everyday fact. Where does that put us as individuals? How far can we go in detaching ourselves from that? I'm not talking at the moment about challenging it so much as perhaps withdrawing to some extent from it. There are lots and lots of issues here, for example, connected with war or connected with inequality in our society. But I want to focus on a very simple one today, which is what we eat. And the reason I want to focus on that is that this coming week it happens to be Vegetarian Week, starting tomorrow. Now, I don't want any of you to think, I want to say this straight away, that you don't have to be a vegetarian to come to New Buddha Way. And we're not here to impose any kind of ideas on anybody. We can offer things to people, and it's for each person to look into themselves and ask themselves, answer questions to themselves. No one's here to be interrogated, but if you'd like to question yourselves, then that's fine. So, if we think about what we eat and we connect it with the issue of harm, and we're being honest about ourselves as individuals, not what other people do, but what I do. Is there harm in the way we eat, the way we think of food, and so on? Now, my own finding on this is that there's a lot of harm in it, but that's my own finding. You find out for yourself. It's not for me to moralize about that. It's for you. I'm posing this as a question. So I can tell you what I found out when I look into myself and also when I investigate what it is that I'm actually doing when I'm eating. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the food system that we have in our so-called civilized world is extremely unstable, very vulnerable, very harmful, and probably cannot continue for very long, because we've become separated from the means of generating our own food. There are lots of children being brought up who think that food comes from Tesco's or Sainsbury's. They've never planted anything, they've never grown anything, they've never got soil under their fingernails, they don't know what it is like to grow things, and all that you can learn about life and the interdependence of things from growing things. If you grow things, you will see that everything is eating everything else. No sooner have you planted your cabbages or your lettuces, there's an army of creatures out there that want to compete with you to eat that. And then you have to use all your skills to think about harm as well. Do you just kill them all? Or what? But you don't know this if you don't try to grow food and if you don't think about what you're eating. So there are lots of lessons to be learned which we've forgotten how to learn, because we are living in a bubble which probably cannot continue. In many ways, that bubble is already shrinking and ready to burst. So what I found for myself is that three things basically concerning food, and I will tell you what I found for myself, but then we open it up and you tell me what you think. There are three things with regard to eating meat, for example. Perhaps I should start with a fourth. The fourth thing about eating meat is that it's delicious. Right. Right. End of story. We all know that. Right. The other three things. One, eating a lot of meat is not very good for the health. So it's a health issue here. Eating any kind of meat is probably over a certain limit is not good for the health. But the kind of meat we have these days, because of the way it's actually cultivated, is particularly not good. Some of it has hormones in it, for example, to fatten up the cattle, and those hormones have been transferred to human beings. And in America, created problems with children, for example. The hormones were interfering with their own hormone systems. But there are all sorts of other things in the flesh we consume which have been put there by the large-scale corporations that control the food industry. We just put it in our mouth and we don't think about where it's come from. But even putting that aside, just even if it were grown organically in the garden or in your field, you had your cows, your sheep, etc. There's plenty of medical evidence that a lot of meat is associated with cancer, with cardiac problems, and so on. One of the reasons being that it's difficult to digest and it's got a lot of saturated fat in it and so on. So it's worth thinking about, if I'm trying to follow a path here in which I'm seeking some peacefulness and some wisdom, then it surely must be an issue whether it is wise to eat a lot of meat or even to eat meat at all. But that's a question I'll leave with you. Right. The second reason is requires a bit more understanding about where food comes from and how it's processed and distributed, and how it enters into the physical system of the planet Earth. Let's put it in a very graphic way. If you eat 1 kilo of meat, that's equivalent, I think it's 14 kilos of grain. So 1 kilo of meat, because a cow is further up the food chain, has itself consumed a whole load of other food before it's in a position for us to kill it and eat that 1 kilo of meat. Instead of producing 1 kilo of meat, I could have produced, with the same energy inputs, 14 kilos of grain to feed people. Now this is a world we're going into which has a food shortage, and even more seriously has a severe water shortage. So from the environmental point of view, is it really a good idea for us in the Western world to go on eating large quantities of meat when equivalent amounts of energy and resources could go into producing a lot more grain? The other thing about cattle is that they produce huge amounts of methane. They, if you'll excuse the expression, fart and belch methane. Methane is more than 10 times more powerful global warming gas than carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is bad enough. That's where our problem lies at the moment, in causing climate change. But plants don't fart. In fact, they're taking up carbon dioxide and producing oxygen. Cows, sheep, etc., are living off the plant material, and then we live off them. And when they're breaking down the plant material, they're producing methane. A lot of methane would probably destroy the environment entirely. In fact, the great fear amongst climatologists is as the temperature goes up, only a little bit, all the methane trapped in the Siberian tundra, which is billions of tons of methane, will be released, because at the moment it's trapped by the ice. If that's released, we're in very deep trouble, because it's going to do a lot more damage than the carbon dioxide. So there is an environmental reason why we should be eating less meat, because the cattle industry is a massive industry, again controlled by corporations, promoting its meat, and meat is now being eaten more than ever before in the history of the world, just at a time when we should be eating much less. So there's the second reason. Health, environmental. The third reason is the Dharma reason. And that is that we are failing to see the connection between ourselves and all other creatures. Can you look a cow in the face and then decide to slit its throat yourself and then cut a chunk off its backside and eat it? No. You probably wouldn't want to do that. There may be some odd people out there that could do that, but I think most of us in this room probably would not wish to do that because there's something horrifying, at least distasteful, about doing that. Because if you looked at a cow, pat it on the head, what will you see? A docile, harmless creature that just eats grass. And I'm going to plunge a knife into its neck and cut a slice off its backside. I wouldn't do that. I don't think most of us would do that. Now, the reason I can do it is because I don't carry out those actions myself. It goes on in a place somewhere else, in a large building, where it's all mechanised, and the cows are strung up, and the machine slits their throat, and blood is everywhere, etc., etc. And then it's all neatly packaged, and ends up in Tesco's, and then I can take it home and put it in my mouth. So in other words, I can absolve myself of any responsibility because of the distance between me and what is actually going on. It's like those pilots of bomber aircraft. They fly over, or they used to fly over, say, Vietnam, and drop napalm, or Agent Orange, a defoliant. And all they ever saw was a flash. They didn't see children burning. Would they want to do that to people they don't know, they don't see, that have never done them any harm? No, but they can do it because it's at a distance. They fly on, they go home, and they end up back in their kitchen at home and their dining room watching TV with their kids. Meanwhile, they've just left carnage behind them. But it's an attention issue that we learn about in the Buddha Dharma. There's nothing to attend to because they're so far from the consequences of their actions. And this probably is the big obstacle to human understanding at the moment, is that we do not see the consequences of our individual actions any longer because it's all become too complex for us to understand, let alone see it. But if we can see it, if we can understand it, I'll put a challenge to you. Go to an abattoir, spend 30 minutes there, and then make up your mind whether you want to continue eating cows. So there are three reasons that if we do see the cow and its big watery eyes as being related to me and to all life, then I may be as horrified about eating a cow as eating another human being. Which, of course, at an earlier stage of humanity, we did do, under specific conditions of war and so on, was actually eat each other. Now, putting people like Geoffrey Hunt aside, who was obviously mentally ill, we don't normally eat each other. Why not? Why don't we do that? I'm sure there's some people here that are very tasty. We don't. It's obvious that we don't do that. We don't need an explanation. But then we need an explanation for not eating cows or sheep or goats or ducks or whatever, right? That's because we think of them as alien, nothing to do with us, completely separate. And yet if you have a vision of the interconnectedness of all things, see how very, very close we are to them, and secondly, we don't actually need to eat meat. But again, I'll just end where I started, and that is to say, I'm giving you my vision of things, and I leave it with you. You certainly don't have to give up meat. And there's a final question some of you have sometimes asked. Did the Buddha eat meat? The fact is, the Buddha did eat meat. Why? If he is the great champion of peace and interdependence, and yet he ate meat, how did that come about? Well, if you're a teacher wandering about with a begging bowl in rags for 45 years, you're completely at the mercy of what people give you to eat. And he would always say to anyone he encountered, don't kill anything for me. But if you are offering me something that wasn't prepared for me, I will eat it, and thank you very much for taking care of me. In other words, if someone goes to a house and they've already got some pork in it and they're offering it to the Buddha, he is a teacher. He doesn't want to be in a rejecting mood. He doesn't want to reject. He doesn't want to offend. He wants to teach gratitude. So he will accept with gratitude, but he will always say, did you kill that for me? They say, yes, we did. He says, well, sorry, I won't eat that. But if you didn't and it was already there, you say, okay, thank you. Because he's trying to balance gratitude, etc., with the issue about non-harm. Do Buddhists worldwide eat meat? Well, it rather depends where they are. Tibetan Buddhists nearly all eat meat. If you want to know the reason why, go and live in Tibet for just a week and you'll find yourself in a very harsh environment. Very cold, very thin air, practically no topsoil, and they depend on their yaks. Without their yaks, they couldn't live. In other words, without eating some meat, they couldn't live. So that's one reason why Tibetan Buddhists would eat meat. It's connected with the environment that they're in. But they do not have abattoirs and they do not have factory farms. They bring up their cattle with some affection, actually. They're also a source of butter, yak butter, and lots of other things. So they do actually have respect for their yaks, even though they might end up eating them at some point. The picture worldwide is a little mixed. Lots of Buddhists in many places are vegetarians and some aren't. So if you take myself, I'm a sort of quasi-vegetarian. I don't eat meat, but I do eat fish. Lynn is 100% genuine vegetarian, doesn't eat meat or fish, so she's a real vegetarian. My wife does eat meat. I think Lynn's husband probably eats meat. So it's a mixed situation that we've got. And now I'm going to just open it up to you. And I just want you to remember that we're really sincerely not trying to impose anything on you. We're just raising a question which is, I know, a little bit sensitive.
New Buddha Way approaches meditation as a way of life, letting go of East and West, past and future, and starting afresh here and now. To find out more, visit www.newbuddhaway.org.